Hi there, and welcome to the Creative Operations Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Groom, and in this podcast, we'll be talking with creative operations leaders in all kinds of industries, from franchising to finance, from healthcare to hospitality and beyond. We'll be looking to uncover best practices and to see trends that are coming to help you keep your creative operations on brand and on budget at the same time. Enjoy. Welcome, everybody. I'm Kevin Groom, and this is the Creative Operations Podcast 2.0. And in this episode, we're going to talk about a topic that has garnered a lot of interest over the years, and that is templating systems. Templating systems have kind of become all the rage because so many different marketing departments are trying to find ways to operate at scale without increasing headcount. And without endangering brand integrity. And templating systems, of course, like Campaign Drive, are a great way to achieve that goal. The challenge, of course, is whether or not a templating system is really going to be compatible for your user community, for your creative teams, for your brand overall. So we're here today to talk about those really important questions. Is a templating system really right for you? Sounds like a good idea. Is it going to be a good idea in practice? Let's dive in and see what some of those questions are that we should be asking ourselves. The first one, brand culture. So we'll talk about this in more detail, but what you really want to ask yourself when you're considering a templating system, and any templating system, could be InDesign files on an art server, could be enterprise class templating system and DAM combined, or anything in between. But the question you have to ask yourself is your culture ready for templating? And that's something that we'll dive into. Second thing is, content sources. Where is your content coming from, and how well tuned is that content to be flowed into, used within a templating context? Third thing, media types. Back in the day, templating was really built around two major components: traditional print and landing pages or web pages, generally speaking. But nowadays, templating really covers the gamut, from digital display ads to animated ads to on-premise materials to screens that are on-premise, so digital on-prem, and all sorts of things beyond. So one of the things that you want to ask yourself when considering a templating system is, how broad is your media mix today, and how much broader is it likely to grow in the future? Last two issues, user experience. So templating systems, like all software, needs to be easy to use. But that's not the end of the story. Because with templating systems, one of the things you want to do is prevent users from making mistakes. So not only do you want to enable them to do something, that's what all software likes to do, but you want to prevent them from doing other things that you would not approve of or really look kindly upon. And so how do you create a good user experience when the system itself is meant to prevent users from doing something they think they want to do, but perhaps really shouldn't? So we'll talk more about that. And then finally, downstream connections. On this podcast, we've tried to avoid lots and lots of technology jargon. And here we are talking about interconnecting MarTech systems. So a little jargon will creep in here. But here's what you're thinking about. More than the technology, you're thinking about the partners out there in the field. It could be printers. They could be web publishers. They could be any manner a brand activating vendor out there in the field who's going to help you to realize your brand objectives at the local level, and who need to be connected to the system, either loosely or tightly. So we'll talk more about those. So those are the 5 big issues. So let's dive in to number 1, brand culture. So the question we want to ask ourselves here is your brand really going to be compatible with templating of any kind at all? How do you decide that? Here are 3 easy steps. First, poll your creatives. And when we talk about creatives, don't just limit yourself to your in-house agency. Think about those freelancers that you might have working for you, or an agency of record, or multiple agencies of record. Don't just think traditional. Think about digital and traditional combined. And don't just think above the line, as they say in the advertising business. Think about all the materials that are getting created operationally and whether or not the way those things have been created and the people who have created them, are those things compatible with the notion of being templated? A little sidelight. In years past, we've seen a good deal of resistance to templating because it seems to, or at least creatives have sometimes thought that it seems to sap creative of its energy. If that's an opinion that is afoot in your organization, listen to it carefully. Don't just carry on forward with a templating system when that commitment isn't really there. Here's why. The creatives are key to the success of the system. If they do not share your vision of how templates can empower local users without endangering the brand, if they're not on board with that mission, you're going to find it difficult to load the system with content. And new content is the number one driver of user adoption. We've seen that for years. So pull your creatives and listen to them carefully to really see, are they comfortable with giving those local users out there in the field freedom to add content or change content within a framework or a design that they themselves have created? And here's another question that you need to ask when it comes to your creatives. Are they willing to think about interacting with a content management system as a new part of their skill set? Over the past few decades, we've seen creatives have to learn a lot of new technology skills. The evolution of the studio environment over the past 30 years has been just nonstop. And we've seen many creatives become really adept with design technologies of all different kinds. But when you build a templating system, here's what you're asking them to add to their skill set. A little bit of the database administrator, not just the designer. Many creatives will respond very positively to that addition to their skill set. Some, though, may not. And the question you have to ask yourself is, are the people who are really on board with doing this and adding this to their skill set, are they sufficient to really help ensure the success of the system? You want to find at least one. That's the good news. You just need one. But if you don't have one, I would pause and consider whether templating is really right, at least at this point in time. Second, your brand assets. Now, for many organizations who've already begun to make the journey into DAM, this is an easy question to answer. Are your brand assets all in one place in a single repository, a DAM that you have created as your single source of truth? Then you're in a really good position to start adding templating to your brand experience and to your rollout of brand assets and executions. But if, like many organizations, you have some assets over in Dropbox and some assets in art servers on premise, and some assets sitting on individual design machines because they were created by your expert in podcasts or your expert in search engine advertising or whatever else it might be. If these things reside in many different silos, to be truly compatible with a templating evolution, you want to first think about how you're going to bring those assets together into one system that can draw upon or feed your templating experience. So think about how consolidated your assets are. And if they're not yet consolidated, you have DAM in your future as you think about templating. And if DAM is already in your present, then templating can be added. And the question really is, under what rules and regulations? And here's another question that I would ask, and this is one for you folks who've already created a DAM. And so we're starting to think about adding templating to your infrastructure. Is your metadata consistent? Is it well known? Will local users who don't have your sense of your asset library be able to search for, find, and use assets using the metadata that you currently have? Or do you perhaps have a preparatory project for your templating system, which is to make sure that your assets are organized and tagged appropriately so that discovering them is easy and using them in in templates is reliable? Those are two really key questions to ask. Third question, your local marketing community. Will they spend the time it takes to really make the production of local marketing materials a part of their daily life? Or will they instead continue to come to you with one-off requests, even though the system is sitting at their fingertips and you've made it available to them? Will they recognize the value of being able to create their own local marketing materials in a matter of minutes or perhaps even less? Or will they look upon using a system like this as one more burden that's being added to their day by the brand? You want to ask this question and see what the real, honest answer is from as broad a segment of your user community as you can get. This is a step a lot of folks miss early on, mostly because they think that if they've decided that templating is a good thing for the brand, then the users will come along with them. In some environments, that's true. We've seen that with some very large and disciplined brands, that if they decide to roll out a system, the users have to come along, whether they like it or not. But in many organizations, franchise organizations, as a for instance, we've seen that very powerful franchisees who are responsible for a lot of revenue may very well resist the use of a templating system and resist it successfully. So you want to ask your local marketers that question. We'll talk at the end of the podcast about some resources that we can make available to you to help you ask those questions of your creatives, of your assets, and of your local marketers. But those are things that you want to determine before you take the plunge. Two more questions. Your in-house workflow. Are you currently experiencing pain from one-off requests that are coming from the field? In smaller organizations, this can feel like a small irritant at first. And if that is indeed the case, it has not yet risen to the level of being a real problem. You may want to wait on the implementation of a templating system until such time as you really begin to feel like one-off requests are interrupting your workflow. Why do I say that? After all, I work for a templating company. We'd love to sell you a system and work with you on the success of that system. But here's why timing really, really matters. When the one-off pain is significant enough, the distraction is significant enough, you'll find that actually the advent of the templating system is welcomed by your creative team rather than viewed with suspicion. They'll know that what you're trying to do is to empower and force multiply them rather than replace humans with machines. So I would measure the amount of pain that those one-off requests are imposing on your team and pick the time when they will look upon the system as a relief, because that indeed is what it's really supposed to be. And I say that not only about Campaign Draft, but about any templating system. When it launches, one sign of success should be a sense of relief from your in-house team. And here's another one, another place where templating systems can provide relief. And that is if your local marketers are complaining about the amount of time it takes for them to get a job through your current manual workflow. If that time is beginning to grow, if you're beginning to see some dissatisfaction, if, for instance, you do surveys of your franchisee community or your local marketing community, and they are expressing frustration, that's the perfect time to implement a templating system. When that urge or that pent-up demand has begun to build, because when you launch, you'll find that your assets get used, that your one-off requests fall dramatically, and your users feel the benefit in reduced turnaround time. So they understand that the extra work that they might do by logging into a system and using it is more than paid off by the time savings and cost savings that it produces. And then finally, this one's a big one. It's probably my favorite one of all. Are you ready as an organization? Is your brand ready to assign a human being, a person who is ready to be the champion of the templating system? This doesn't have to be a full-time job. It can be much less than that, but it is a significant responsibility and it should be part of the job description. You can't simply add this to someone's workload without recognizing that this takes significant amounts of time, not just in the setup, but in the ongoing maintenance. Now, if all of this sounds like I'm trying to discourage you from using a templating system, that's not it at all. Really, what I'm trying to do is to make sure you have a sense of the commitment you need to make to the system in order for that system to really perform, really achieve its promises. And I think those questions are critical. So let's move on to number 2. Where's your content coming from? In terms of content, templating systems are driven by user information, store information, and product information. Now, for most organizations, that kind of content is coming from 3 very different silos. Let's start with users. Your users may have access to your systems through a centralized single sign-on experience or through a centralized registry. If you have such an infrastructure, then you're going to be able to gather a lot of information about users and populate templates with that information quickly, easily, and reliably. If, however, your system or that information, needs to be input manually, you need to spend time and account for that time, not just in the setup, but as that information changes over time. So as users turn in and out of the organization, and as their information itself changes. You'll need to think about whether or not your user information needs to be used in templates and to what extent do you have that information authoritatively. If you do have it and you can manage it, here's the great news. A templating system will make the creation and population of documents single-click easy. That will make your local marketers happy. That will make your brand managers happy because the number of errors and the number of simple one-off requests drops dramatically. But you've got to make sure that you have reliable, authoritative information on users so it can populate templates and achieve that goal. And then here's another thing that you'll want to think about when it comes to users and the content or the information that's associated with them. And that is the different levels of roles and permissions. As a marketer with a templating system, you're going to be thinking about access control. That's a techie term for really describing what a user should be allowed to do or should not be allowed to do on any kind of system. And with templating in particular, because for the most part, folks are producing publicly available documents intended for public consumption. For the most part, those systems need to be driven by authoritative, well-defined roles. Second, locations. If you have a franchisee network or a location store network that's growing rapidly, you're going to want to think about how do you onboard locations to the system post-launch. And you're going to want to think about whether or not your stores are organized regionally or by franchise management or by both organizational principles, and how do you deliver the right content to the right locations at the right time. All of those are questions you want to ask yourself when you're thinking about your content. And then finally, if like more and more customers these days, you are trying to modularize your content, you're trying to break apart the, let's say, product information from the templates or the designs in which it's been embedded for months or perhaps years. Here's what you need to find: an authoritative source for your product descriptions and your specs. Is all of that content spread across countless InDesign files? You've got a migration ahead. Or is that content already available in a database? You have an integration ahead. So those are things to think about. Third question, media types. The chart you see here shows you an example of the different media types that we see on templating systems today. Look down the left-hand column. You'll see print, digital, HTML and animated banners, landing pages, email, social media, search, and outdoor. Here are the questions you want to ask yourself. Are you using these components in your marketing mix? Are these components meant to be customizable? Do they need to be ordered from a downstream or external vendor, one or more? How many different templates of each media type do you have? And then finally, in what order of priority should you be releasing these templates on your ordering system so that you can start somewhere immediate, that delivers real meaningful business value, but then you can grow the system over time and really fulfill more and more of the local marketing media mix with your system as time goes by. And the reason I suggest that you do this in an order of priority, a sequence, actually, there's two reasons. Number one, users love it when new media types show up on templating systems. They'll log in to look at this content and look at these capabilities simply to understand why they're there and how they work. And then the second reason it's great to do that is that as you learn from your user community about what they're trying to do, you can fine tune your template and content management strategies to fit the needs of your user community. So rather than having a big bang launch, think more about parading out a steady stream of new capabilities across media types and new templates within a media type. Those are all good practices for achieving success. Speaking of user experience, let's turn to that as question number 4. When we talk about user experience, remember that a templating system wants to make it very easy for users to get done what they want to get done, and very hard for them to get done things they want to get done but shouldn't do. That's a really important point to keep in mind. And so here are a couple questions to help you get there. First, how many walled gardens do you need in your templating system? Do you have multiple brands? And do each one of those brands need to have a user community that works within that environment and only in that environment? Do you have users within your community who need to be able to move from one brand to another at their discretion? And under what rules? These are the kind of questions you want to ask yourself so that you can organize your system and set user expectations clearly right from the very beginning and then grow comfortably, not just over the next few months, but over the next few years. Second question, regulation. Do you have the need to have content reviewed before it goes into the system? And do you need to have that content subsequently reviewed when it's used on the system? Those are two really good questions to ask yourself, not just whether or not you need it done, but who would be doing the reviews and when. If you find that you have external authorities who need to review content, make sure you bring them in to the implementation process and perhaps even to the decision-making process about the templating system early, because they will be gating factors for success. And speaking of approvals, you may, in a good templating system, turn on or turn off an approval loop pretty much at your will. If you've got a template that has lots and lots of freedom, you may turn the approval loop on to protect your users from mistakes. If you have a template that's very locked down in its content and pre-populated, you may turn that approval loop off to save your team time. Really important to ask yourself that time question when it comes to approvals. Do you have folks who know how to play the role of approver, and do they have time in their schedule to play it in a timely way? Because if you don't, the approval process itself could become a backlog, a bottleneck. That's the word I was looking for, a bottleneck in your workflow, when really what you want your templating system to do is to eliminate bottlenecks entirely. And finally, downstream connections. Remember that we were talking about how today's templating systems are connected to more and more points of brand activation at the local level. As you're thinking about whether or not a templating system is right for you and your brand, you want to think about those connections. Let's start with printers. Do you have a single printer that you're going to connect to the system that handles all of your workload across all of your locations? Or is it possible that you have many vendors spread out geographically, or perhaps used for specific levels of expertise that they might have? Print on demand versus sheet fed offset, or large run printing, web or large format printing, whatever the case may be. Do you have one or many printers? And do these printers demonstrate a willingness to integrate with, use your system to receive orders for their operation to fulfill? You'll want to have those conversations, at least conceptually, early on in the process. And don't limit yourself to printers alone. Think also about ad serving and ad trafficking vendors, if those are part of your marketing workflow at the local level. Think about websites and social media sites that each may have its own sizing and trafficking parameters to consider. Gather up your vendor community, much as you would gather up your user community, and make sure that they understand what's coming and that they are ready to participate when the time is right. And then the last point I would make too is that in many marketing portals of this kind, you'll also find that there's a company store. And merchandise brings in a whole new range of vendors as well, whether that's apparel or branded items of all different varieties. Those vendors too should be part of your community, should be identified, given good advance notice that a system is coming, and should have the ability to sign on and use the tools that you'll be providing them. Otherwise, they too could be a bottleneck point when what you're trying to do is to create a smooth supply chain for marketing concepts and materials as much as you can. And that's enough for today. We've covered a lot of ground here and probably went a little bit longer than this podcast does. But I wanted to offer you all a notion to consider with regard to resources. Go to pikeandine.com and click on the resources link, and there you'll find some calculators and some template questionnaires that can help you to ask these questions for your brand specifically, so that as you embark on the journey toward templating, you know where you're beginning, you know where you want to go, and you know who has to come along with you, who in your organization is going to be critical for your success. And we'll see you the next time on the Creative Operations Podcast 2.0. Thanks for listening.